All right, let's dive right into this explainer. I want you to transport yourself back, say, 60,000 years to prehistoric Europe to face what was probably humanity's most relentless and, let's be honest, completely unglamorous threat: continuous rain. When we think about ancient history, we almost always imagine these super dramatic things: massive predators, vast migrations, epic battles for survival. But the reality? The everyday baseline condition of just being human meant surviving an environment that was literally constantly trying to freeze you out.
Picture this. You're standing in a dense, wet forest. You have no roof over your head, no dry clothes to change into, and the temperature is dropping just enough to kill you. Ask yourself, how on earth did early humans manage this daily reality without any modern tools? You don't have a waterproof Gore-Tex jacket, there's absolutely no hot coffee waiting for you indoors, and the rain, well, it might not stop for weeks. Literally everything you fundamentally need to survive, your warmth, your food, your fire, becomes exponentially harder to get the wetter it gets outside.
It's actually kind of crazy how easily we've forgotten the true danger of bad weather. I mean, today, a rainy day is basically just a minor inconvenience, right? We check a weather app, we decide to stay inside, maybe crank up the central heating. But for our ancient ancestors, it was a totally fundamentally different story. Unchecked rain caused rapid hypothermia, it rotted their hard-earned food, it flooded their living spaces, and worst of all, it killed life-saving fires. A dead fire in a cold storm wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an absolute disaster.
Now, the real danger here comes down to one absolutely staggering number: 25. Water conducts heat away from the human body roughly 25 times faster than air. 25 times. That means a wet, windy 10 degrees Celsius day was a highly efficient, silent killer. It is quite literally the difference between sitting in a chilly room and sitting in a freezing cold lake. Your body starts losing heat at a rate that your metabolism simply cannot compensate for. You don't even need sub-zero temperatures to succumb to hypothermia. You really just need some wet clothes and a stiff breeze. Okay, so that brings us to Section 1, Fire as Living Infrastructure.
To really grasp how they survived this, we need a massive paradigm shift in how we think about fire. Because fire and rain are natural enemies, ancient humans treated fire almost exactly like we treat the electrical grid today. They maintained continuous hearths for years, literally years, never letting them go out. Because trying to start a fire from absolute scratch in the pouring rain with your bare hands, it's incredibly difficult. For them, a dead fire in the rain was quite literally a death sentence written in wet ash. So they didn't treat fire as a one-off event. They treated it as a living, breathing thing that demanded constant 24/7 care.
And the ways they pulled this off, honestly, absolutely ingenious. Different cultures all over the world perfected ways to transport this living heat. Embers would be carefully wrapped in slow-burning materials, stuff like damp moss, fungus, or specific types of tree bark. The Inuit used completely enclosed containers, while indigenous Australians figured out how to utilize specific, slow-burning woods to carry live embers for hours across the wet landscape. And to make sure this worked, they created highly specialized roles. Someone in the group would be the designated firekeeper. During bad weather, their sole job, their only priority, was to sit with that fire, shield those carried embers, and feed the flames so the group wouldn't wake up cold and in the dark. Moving right along to Section 2, Engineering Shelter and Materials. We all kind of have this default image of primitive cavemen just, hiding out in caves waiting for the rain to stop. But the reality is they physically engineered their way out of the weather. Just look at the massive cognitive leap required to create leather. This step-by-step process required incredible abstract planning. Think about it. An animal is killed today. Then, its hide is laboriously scraped and processed over several days, often using animal fat or brains to create this natural water resistance. And then that finished waterproof product protects someone's skin weeks later. They were literally solving a weather problem today that wouldn't actually hit them for weeks. That is highly sophisticated, abstract problem solving.
And they didn't just stop at clothing. They applied this exact same brilliant engineering to their homes, too. Get this. The oldest known constructed shelters date back 400,000 years. So long before Homo sapiens even existed, hominins with smaller brains than ours independently invented the basic principles of modern roofing. They angled branches and they layered leaves in these overlapping rows exactly like modern roof shingles, so the rain would run off rather than drip straight through. Eventually, this engineering evolved into structures dating back 15,000 years, built from incredibly heavy mammoth bones that were anchored deep into the ground and covered in tightly stretched hides to completely exclude moisture and trap body heat.
All right, let's look at Section 3, Mastering the Wet Landscape. All of this builds into an environmental literacy that frankly seems almost supernatural to us today. Because they couldn't just casually check a phone, ancient humans learned to read atmospheric signals as fluently as we read street signs. The smell of petrichor in the air, the sight of birds suddenly flying lower because the atmospheric pressure was dropping, swarming insects, or even just the exact texture of the clouds and subtle wind shifts. Being able to read these signs meant they could make critical group shelter decisions hours before a single drop of rain even fell. They generally didn't get caught out in massive downpours because they essentially spent their entire lives reading the sky. But knowing the rain was coming was really only half the battle, right? The other half was what we'd call terrain intelligence. They inherently understood that cold air sinks and water runs downhill. That meant they actively, deliberately avoided camping in hollows or valleys where wet air would just pool and freeze them. If they're in the northern hemisphere, they sought out south-facing slopes because they knew those would dry way faster in the sun. They used dense broadleaf canopies as giant umbrellas to physically intercept the rainfall, and they would repeatedly, generation after generation, return to the exact same geographical rock overhangs that offered natural waterproofing simply to save themselves hours of exhausting construction time. Which leads us perfectly into Section 4, Biological and Social Infrastructure. So how did their actual physical bodies and their communities adapt to these brutal, soaking wet conditions? Well, first, let's talk about the cold shock response. This is an autonomic cascade of physiological reactions, stuff like hyperventilation and massive cardiovascular stress, that happens when your body hits cold water. Because ancient humans didn't have cozy thermostats to retreat to, their baseline physiological reaction was perfectly calibrated through lifelong continuous cold training. This daily exposure basically dampened that initial shock, completely preventing the sheer panic and risk of drowning that modern humans so often experience today when we're plunged into freezing water. And it gets even more fascinating when you look at the genetics. We can literally see how genetic selection and regular cold exposure fundamentally change their bodies. We see higher resting metabolic rates and, crucially, much higher levels of what's called brown adipose tissue in cold-adapted populations. This is a very specific type of fat that generates heat directly rather than just passively storing energy for later use. Populations like the Inuit developed bodies that were shaped over thousands of years to handle extreme environments. They weren't just surviving despite their bodies, they were surviving with bodies that were organically engineered for the cold. But hey, biology was really only part of the equation here. Surviving the rain was, at its core, a team sport. They utilized densely packed communal sleeping arrangements to share body heat because, honestly, personal privacy is very much a warm weather luxury. And during bad weather, there was a strict, non-negotiable division of labor. The younger, physically robust individuals would take on the physically demanding tasks of foraging and keeping the camp together. The older individuals would use their vast, accumulated experience to make those critical decisions about movement and exactly where to place the shelter. Meanwhile, children were deliberately kept right in the center of the group, heavily protected by everyone else's shared body heat. This social setup actually highlights something incredibly profound. The death of an experienced elder wasn't just a sad social tragedy for the tribe, it was a devastating survival event. It literally meant the sudden loss of irreplaceable institutional Reen survival knowledge. And this is very likely why we see early archaeological evidence of ancient groups taking the time and resources to care for older, non-reproductive individuals. It wasn't just some abstract sense of altruism. It was the highly rational preservation of the exact people who knew which tree bark burned the absolute slowest and how to perfectly read a valley before a storm rolled in. Now, when the rain just wouldn't stop, the daily menu had to completely shift, and the group's resilience relied absolutely on opportunistic solutions. Anticipating the rot, they deliberately buried caches of dried meat and nuts ahead of time. When the environment completely flooded out, they pivoted. They opportunistically targeted whatever surfaced: earthworms, snails, frogs, and wet weather fungi. And most importantly, during this severe caloric squeeze, there was a rule of strict, equitable sharing. A well-fed individual in a starving group is just a casualty waiting to happen, so absolutely zero individual hoarding was tolerated. You shared or you all died. Let's wrap things up with Section 5, Thriving in the Storm. Let's zoom out for a second and look at humanity's overall relationship with extreme weather. Today, our modern view is basically that rain is an interruption, right? It ruins our weekend plans and sends us all running indoors. But the ancient view was vastly, fundamentally different. They didn't just accidentally stumble into monsoon-soaked Southeast Asia or the freezing subarctic and get stuck there. They specifically, intentionally sought out these extreme wet climates. Why? Because of the massive biological abundance the rain provided.
The exact same rain that made staying warm so difficult also filled the rivers with fish and triggered massive blooms of plants, game, and fungi in the forests. The crucial takeaway here is that this wasn't just some primitive scraping by survival. It was the foundational engineering of early civilization built by heavily trained humans who simply refused to give up. Literally every piece of technology we use to manage rain today, whether it's the high-tech Gore-Tex in your hiking jacket, the central heating in your house, or even the complex modern drainage systems in your city, it is all quite literally downstream of an ancient human stubbornly figuring out that water runs downhill and that rubbing certain animal fats on a hide can keep you dry. Which really brings us to one final, kind of provocative thought. If our ancient ancestors managed to engineer global survival out of nothing but sticks, animal hides, and incredibly deep communal knowledge, what vital environmental intelligence are we losing today in our highly comfortable, climate-controlled modern world? We've basically outsourced our environmental awareness, our ability to feel the pressure drop, to read the sky and the terrain, to glowing screens. It really makes you wonder just how much raw, innate human capability we willingly traded away for a weather app on our phones, doesn't it?